Tim, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, it'll be a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. So my name is Tim Mawson. I'm one of 2 philosophy fellows here at St. Peter's, which is one of the 30 or so independent colleges that federate to make the University of Oxford. And so my professional job is teaching and thinking about philosophy. And I tend to specialize in thinking about things in philosophy and religion in the analytic tradition. So traditional puzzles surrounding divine properties and arguments for and against God's existence and things like that. And I'm also dean at the college at the moment, for what that's worth, which isn't as much money as I hoped it would be when I took on the role.
I'm a YouTuber, which is also not as much money as I was hoping for.
Yeah, we were sadly misinformed and made some poor career choices.
Exactly. So tell me more about the position. Would God make life more meaningful or less meaningful? What is your take on that?
Thank you very much. Yes, so you mentioned in sort of an interchange before we started our discussion that you'd been kind enough to notice my book, Monotheism and the Meaning of Life. And in that book, I argue that there are lots of questions one might sensibly think of oneself as asking when one asks what's the meaning of life. And in that book, I explore what difference God, were he to exist, would make to the answers to several of those. And broad brush, the answer is that he plays a crucial role in the correct answer to a lot of those questions. If he exists, if he doesn't exist, he doesn't play such a role, of course. And that if he were to exist, it would make life in various respects more meaningful. In another book, I argue that it would make life in various other respects less meaningful, but on balance, it comes out net positive.
So also, could you tell me more about the reasons that are the positive and the negative ones? I'd be interested in those as well.
Sure. So thinking about negative ones first, maybe. There's a sense of meaningfulness, it seems to me. So one could imagine this scenario. Imagine you're appointed to be a junior widget affixer in a factory, and a conveyor belt is in front of you, and every time a piece of machine comes back, you just stick this thing on. You don't really know what the thing does, and you'd once asked your supervisor what it did, and they said, your job isn't to know what it does, your job is just to fix it. So you're fixing this thing, and you ask your supervisor, oh, do you mind if I put up a poster in my workplace that says, you don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps, or has a cat or something? No, you can't do that, just stick widgets on. Oh, okay, fine. Do you mind if, no, you can't do that, just stick widgets on. So in the most sort of maximal extent sort of possible, you're really alienated from the product of your labor. You just, serve the purpose of sticking widgets on. Well, you obviously have very little, there's a sense of meaning in which you have very little meaning. So what is that sense? Well, your job, at least in your work life, maybe at home things are very different, one hopes they are, but in your work life, you could say, I find this a very meaningless activity. And what is that? Well, there are various aspects to it, but one aspect of it might be, I've got no creative autonomy. It's not up to me what I do. I'm just told to do this thing. Maybe this thing is really worth doing. Maybe these widgets are building medical apparatus that's saving thousands of people. But, I don't have any say in how I fix the widgets, in how I contribute to the process. And so I've got no real autonomy over my role in a scheme of things. And even if the scheme of things is a great scheme of things, that I've been given this role rather than anything else, other role wasn't really my choice. Although, maybe you'd have to, well, how did you get into a job if at least you didn't apply for a job? But, maybe in the extremes, it wasn't really your choice. You were just thrown into this job, given the job. You have to do the job this particular way. You don't have really any say in the job. And Sartre thought that if there was a God, then our roles in life would be a bit like that. We'd be reduced, his example is to the state of pen knives, things, the function of which has been assigned by another, and they have that job to do, and it's not really up to them to deviate from the plan that's been set for them. And whilst I think that the extreme lengths to which Sartre took that view are not tenable, I think there's some truth in that. So I think if there is a God of the sort that Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship, he has laid down some patterns for our life, which it's not up to us to choose, oh, you know what, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do it this way. In a way, he sort of shrugs his shoulders. You might wish to do it that way, but that's cutting against the grain of reality as I've constructed it for you. So, yeah, you just can't get out from under this. He's not quite such the sort of micromanager that the supervisor in my thought experiment would be, but he's something of a manager. Like it or not, we are working for someone other than ourselves. We're not self-employed. And that's a restriction in a certain type of meaningfulness that our lives would have had they, per impossible, been as they are, except there had been no body for whom we were working. Then we would have had more of that sort of liberty, more of that sort of meaning. So that's one of the ways in which I think God's existence could make things worse. What do you think?
I definitely would agree in that context that in a way you're a slave to someone else's motive, in which case that would definitely probably indicate that there's less meaning. But I'd be curious what exactly meaning, how would we define meaning in this context? Because I would say that if meaningfulness is defined as how I would define it, would be something like maximization of one's own goals or values or something along those lines. Then obviously being forced to work for someone else's ends may or may not be in accordance with the meaning in your life. Like maybe you want to serve this God or whatever, in which case it's perfectly meaningful to be a slave to this God. And so it would actually maximize your meaning to be a part of the system, whatever it is. Whereas, of course, from an atheist perspective, I want to have nothing to do with the God. I want my own little universe where I can go play video games and watch anime. And so it would be completely contradictory to my meaning. And so I'd be curious how you would define meaning and what a maximization of meaning would look like from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I think that's a very good set of considerations to bring to bear. So my own view is that meaningfulness comes in many different sorts. So there are many meanings of life. And so when one asks about, well, how meaningful is this situation to the person in it? One's probably asking a number of questions, and well, meaningful in this sense, very much so. Meaningful in that sense, not so much so. So even in my example, as I gave it and unpacked it, there were various sorts of countervailing considerations going on. So one might say, well, if your job as widget fixer really is producing ambulances which are going out into a needy part of the world and saving lots and lots of lives, well, then that is objectively a very meaningful activity for you, however disenchanted you are from the whole process and however much you wish that you had some time off to go and do something that you would find more pleasurable. And that's obviously a very sort of contributing to the objective value of reality sort of meaningfulness. Your life is meaningful to the extent that you contribute to the objective value in reality, regardless of how you might happen to feel about it. Then there's a much more sort of subjective sort, which seemed to be the sort of meaningfulness that you had in mind, which was if you believe of yourself, or maybe it has to be correctly believe of yourself, that you're maximizing that which is personally effectively attractive to you, and in your case it might be watching video games or playing video games or so on, well then your life becomes more meaningful in virtue of your engagement with that activity. And that seems to be a very subjective sort of meaningfulness. And so I'm happy to hold that both of these are sorts of meaningfulness. And then in addition, there's this other thing, which isn't quite either of those two, which is the extent to which your life and certain of its broad themes and parameters is a subject of your own unconstrained, to an extent, I mean, everyone's will is constrained, except God's if it exists, unconstrained choices. So your life might be less meaningful for you, even if you are in a job which is objectively significant, and suppose you feel effectively drawn to it. So you actually think, gosh, I can think of nothing I'd enjoy more than sticking widgets on the conveyor belt, things on the conveyor belt goes past me. It might still be the case that if you weren't free to choose whether or not to be the sort of person who would find those things attractive, or to be in that place in the factory, well, then your life is less meaningful for you not having had that level of self-creative choice in being the sort of person you are and being in the situation you are. And people's lives can be more meaningful to the extent that they have more autonomy of that particular sort over their, I mean, in the end, they'll have to be to some extent their character and then their positioning in the world. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask about the objective definition of meaning there, because I'm not sure, like, where would we stack the hierarchy here? So say someone was trapped as a slave in like a hamster wheel kind of thing, but the hamster wheel kept people alive. It was generating electricity and saved billions of lives, keeping all these other people alive by this person being trapped in this hamster wheel. But they're suffering. They just hate it. They don't want to be here. Some evil being put them here and they had no choice in it. Now, from their perspective, their life has no meaning. They're trapped. They're miserable. They hate it here, even though objectively it's saving lots of lives.
Yeah.
And so it would be, I would think that the way we would measure meaning would be based on each individual subjective being in this context. And so it would add meaning to all the other beings who he's saving their lives, but it would subtract meaning from his life. And so I don't know if you could really count that as an objective sense of meaning. It would just be a bunch of different subjective senses of meaning. And so I don't know how to assess an objective sense of meaning in that context, because it seems like the subjective, what values to you or to each individual, is the highest context of what meaning could be.
Okay, yeah. So I think you might be skeptical about the existence of this thing which I gestured to and called objective meaning. So I was rather supposing, as I was laying it out, that if someone is, as a matter of fact, as a result of going around on the hamster wheel in a certain way, saving a lot of people's lives, they were making a difference to the universe, which then positively affected the quality of their own life with regard to the meaningfulness of an objective sort. And it did so regardless of that positive effect needing to go through some desire that they happen to have to be in that situation. So things can be good or bad for people without it seeming to them that they're good or bad for them, or without them feeling particularly sentimentally drawn towards those things which are nevertheless good or bad for them. To try and motivate that thought, I might ask you, what would you say about someone who made someone go blind by administering a drug which simultaneously removed from them the desire to see? Have they harmed that person in any respect?
Yes.
Okay. Even though by the time the drug has had its effects, made them blind and they don't want to see, and perhaps they're terribly delighted to be blind. So it's not just that they're neutral about the prospect, they actually feel a lot better about being blind than they felt about being able to see, because for most of us who can see, it doesn't occur to us except now and again that we're very lucky to be able to see, and so we don't actually effectively feel drawn to the whole project of going on seeing too much. It's just if we have some eye condition or something that we suddenly realize how lucky we are to be able to see. But on your account, it would be that no, it's okay if they so you'd say, oh, okay, yeah, you've harmed the person, and yet you've harmed them in a more objective way than I thought you were going to allow, because it seems as if the harm is not one that's befallen them in virtue of their feeling disaffected with the state that they're in.
Well, I am a moral realist, so I think there is objective value, but I would measure it as any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. And so if the person at time T says that they want to see, and you drug them and you force them to not see, and you just like zap their brain so when they wake up and they don't remember this, because you've violated their will at the previous time, you've done an immoral action, even if they don't remember it in the future.
Okay. So good. So sorry, I mistook it when I thought, oh, you're not really a great fan of objective value by the sounds of it. It sounds as if, oh, well, I am a great fan of at least one objective value, the objective value of not interfering with other people's choices. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So it might be then that let's see. Do we now need to? I mean, I might think, gosh, this is a pretty odd view with the greatest respect. So, I mean, there are all sorts of things which you might think, oh, gosh, somebody's says something foolish, and they don't understand the situation in front of them, but they choose one way. Surely sometimes a doctor can justify saying, well, look, if you knew what I know now, you thank me for giving you this medicine, but this is an emergency triage situation, and so I can't actually, I'm sorry to say, fully respect your choices now. I'm going to wait until you wake up and have been saved and find out about it later, and then I think you'll thank me for having net benefited you, even though you will say that one drawback of the situation is that I violated appropriate consent in giving you this life-saving drug. You will not think that the only value that we need to bear in mind to decide whether or not I ought to have done what I did was whether or not I violated your consent. You'll take as a weighty consideration, and one which is even weightier than this, that I in the end saved your life, or something of that sort. So I might sort of think, it sounds a bit weird, and I think you could get sort of some odd results.
That would be a pragmatic consideration. So I would like to say that in my definition, if we lived in the best of all possible worlds, there would be no natural consequences. So you would be able to consent to all possible actions in your world: cancer, death, aging. You'd be like, nope, those are off the list, not options. And so there's the only reason that it's justified for a doctor to say, cut your leg off, because they have to save it, to save your life, because if you don't, the bacteria is going to kill you or whatever. That in and of itself, I think, is a damaging to the well-being of a person if you're in a universe in which that is the case. And so in my model, you would have to consent to be in such a universe in the first place, and so you wouldn't even have the consequences of a risk of losing your leg, and so there'd be no justification for a doctor cutting it off, because there would be no a reason to try to prevent some greater evil, because the greater evil would just be omitted from the universe. And so in this context, where it's physically impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to, which include death, rocks falling on them, gravity, whatever. In this universe, there would be no greater evil that could justify some kind of involuntary imposition. So the doctor would have no justification to cut your leg off, because you could just snap your fingers and say, I no longer wish to be infected, but problem solved. And so if this world was the case, then there would be no reason to infringe on anybody else's will, as long as each individual couldn't impose on any other individual. And then it would be the maximization of well-being, a perfect world of well-being.
I think then people would also have to know what was in their own best interests perfectly, would they? Otherwise, they might, on the basis of partial information, choose to do something which would be suboptimal for them. Or would you say, well, actually, no, my understanding of interest is just you maximize the lack of interference with your will by future people, and maybe that doesn't need knowledge. I don't know.
Well, since it's people and the universe, I wouldn't really make much of a difference. So, for example, say I wanted to experience a very traumatizing experience, like playing Dark Souls, if that's a video game reference, if you know what that is. But since I'm essentially the governor of my universe, in that I can redefine the laws of physics any way I want, if I'm going through a traumatizing experience, I can just go, okay, escape, essentially, or turn it off, or whatever. And so we don't need to worry about this idea of well-being or what people need to know what's best for their well-being, because they can change it whenever they need to.
Okay. Okay, so let's just leave that on the table for a moment. Back to the hamster wheel guy. I guess if the hamster wheel guy is in a world such as you suppose this world to be, where the only objective disvalue is interference with others' autonomy, then if he is producing a objective good by his hamster wheel spinning, he'll need to be doing something which is decreasing the number of sort of autonomy invasions that are going on in the world relative to what would have been the case had he not been spinning his hamster wheel.
Well, and then you'd say, quite. So I would clarify that it's not a counterbalancing where one involuntary imposition justifies other involuntary, or makes other involuntary impositions moral. I'd say that if you, like the trolley problem, if you flip the switch to kill the one, you've still killed one. You have done an immoral action. It's not moral to flip the switch and kill the one. It's just less immoral than killing the five. And so in this context, based on my definition of what well-being would be, in order to maximize the well-being in the situation, you would need to give the guy in the hamster wheel the freedom to go to his own universe and to live however he wants to live, and to give all of the people who he's sustaining through the electricity of the wheel, they would also be able to need to go to their own world and live in the way they want to choose, independent of this requirement of electricity to live. And so my definition of well-being would be to give each individual in this scenario the freedom to choose to live in their own world of their own accord, without these constraints of electricity or the hamster wheel. And I think that would be the highest amount of meaning you can get out of the situation.
Right. And so that would be the highest in principle achievable, but we might now be considering a world where those options are causally inaccessible to the agents in them. So the guy has been shoved by just purely natural processes into a hamster wheel and has found himself spinning it, and is now reflecting on the fact that if he stops spinning it, the way it's hooked up will mean that a load of other people have their autonomy invaded. And at the moment, it's him spinning it that stops them having their autonomy invaded. And he'll be reflecting on the fact that, well, but now I've come to think about it, my autonomy is being invaded by, or was invaded by, this impersonal mechanism that shoved me into this, even if that wasn't a moral wrong, because it was an impersonal mechanism. Anyway, here I am in the wheel. Ought I to stop spinning it? Is it in my self-interest to stop spinning it? And so he's making those sorts of choices. I can't, unfortunately, generate a world in which we all go off to our separate, parallel universes and live autonomously without ever bumping into anyone else. But I can decide whether or not to sort of step off this wheel or to keep spinning it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by your account, in that scenario, he has some objective reasons to stay in the wheel and spinning it, because, well, if he doesn't, then there's going to be a hell of a load of people a lot worse off than if he does. But he has got what is also an objective reason in his own well-being is of objective value as well as these other guys. But you might say, well, if you do the maths, it looks as if you were consequentialist, it's less weighty reason to sort of get off the wheel, because his own autonomy is being infringed in this case on the assumption that he doesn't himself want to actually be on the wheel and he's only doing it for the sake of others. So I think even with your account of value, which did somewhat sort of bowl me a googly, if that's an expression. Is that an expression in left field? I think is that baseball? Yeah. So in cricket, if someone bowls someone a googly, it's a slightly different sort of thing going on with the ball, but it means the same as it comes at someone from left field. I think. Anyway, to confuse me a bit. But I think even on your account, if I understand it right, okay, there probably will be in the actual world that we're in some things which one does which affect the objective value of other people's lives for good or ill, and some things which sometimes one faces a trade between doing the thing which would be best for other people and doing the thing which would be best for oneself. And I'm suggesting that the same is sort of, it is true for a certain type of meaningfulness, and you might find yourself in that situation whereby even if you were doing, suppose you were some sort of, rather than a hamster, you were some sort of disaffected charity worker, and you were really good at moving figures around Excel spreadsheets, and you were working in the back room in some charity, and all you did was sit in this sort of dingy office moving figures around spreadsheets. But you were really good at that. And the net effect of your moving the figures around in the way that you did meant that the logistics for the charity worked really well, and all sorts of food got to people who wouldn't get to it if you hadn't moved the figures around properly. But you really hate this job, and you've really become disaffected from it, disenchanted from it. You wish you could get up and leave, and you go to your manager one day and say, "Look, I just don't think it's for me anymore. I think I'm going to resign." And look, you can promote Smith over there, who could do it. And they point out quite clearly, but Smith is actually pretty bad at this, and we can just see, we've already done the sums. We can see that 20 people a day will die if you resign from this job, and Smith takes over, who wouldn't die if you stayed in it. Then I think you say, all right, okay. Of course, I'm not solely assessing this by reference to how many people's autonomy is going to be affected by this, but okay, I think that's probably going to mean that 20 people are going to have their autonomy pretty adversely affected if you lose the job, give up the job. So you might say, okay, so maybe my claim would be we can make sense of the fact that your job might be, or staying in the job might be more objectively meaningful. It might make your life more a life which is such that at the end of it, it will have been more worth living in terms of these objective goods. But it'll make it subjectively less meaningful if you stay in the job. It will make it a life which, although it was objectively more worth living, won't have felt that way to you from the inside. And so on your deathbed, as it were, when you're asked if you have any regrets, if you do stay on a job, you'll need to give a conflicted answer, because in one respect, you'll say, well, objectively, I can't regret having saved all those people, because I think that was a good thing. And I'm in some cerebral sense, glad that I did it. But if you're asking me, as it were, how I feel about the fact that I've done that, unless I've had some change of heart on my deathbed, I feel pretty bad about it. It's like, the culmination of a load of bad days at the office where I just ground the figures. And so that if there are these two sorts of meaningfulness that can, in principle, be at loggerheads with one another in the choices that one makes, it might be that their sort of loggerheads nature is one that not even an omnipotent being could do anything to remove. And so this wouldn't be God, if he exists, making things better or worse than they'd otherwise be. It would just be him finding, despite his omnipotence, that there were some trades between goods, all of which, in a sense, it would be good for us to have, and yet not even he can make us have to the maximal extent. Each of them might be possible if we consider them in isolation. So that's why I think God is not unqualified good news for meaningfulness, even though on balance, my view is that, yeah, he is good news for meaningfulness. But these things, there are incommensurabilities here as well, which makes it harder. But there wouldn't be for you, because you don't think there's lots of different values floating around that we need to trade off against each other and then find we can't trade because they're incommensurable and the like.
Yeah. For me, it seems like the problem I would have is that it seems like an omnipotent being would be able to create this best of all possible worlds quite easily. It's not quite a difficult. There's no logical contradiction in it, and so.
Okay.
And in the world I'm suggesting, where we can maximize the meaning by giving everyone their own world that they can design however they want, live however they want at that world, seems very possible for an omnipotent being. And so the only reason that one person would need to sacrifice to keep alive all the other people, like in the case you mentioned of the social worker or whatever, is if some part of nature has already diminished value by limiting people's freedom. So all those people who he's keeping alive, something in nature has already infringed on their value, and this person doing the work is mitigating that infringement that has happened.
Yeah.
But if you remove the infringement, then they no longer need to make the sacrifice. Now, obviously, they'd be moral to sacrifice their own life to benefit others, but I think the reason is because there has already been an immoral action done by the universe or nature or God or whatever, who set this system up in such a way where it would be required to save them in the first place. And so from my perspective, a God who had allowed this to happen would diminish value, or would necessarily have diminished value, because he didn't set it up such that we have our own universe that we can do whatever we want with.
Yeah. So I guess there's a question of what would the best of all possible worlds look like, and it's not clear to me that what the answer to that is, but it might be relatively clear to me that I'm pretty sure it's not a world where each of us is causally insulated from the influence of anybody else, and hence beyond the capacity to be adversely affected by anyone else, because that would be a world where, well, we would just be in our own little sort of, if you like, sort of, solipsistic cotton wool clothed bubbles, and we would never really be in any relationships with anyone else.
Well, keep in mind that it's the maximization of consent, which means if you wanted to live in somebody else's world and they consented to it, that would be fine. Or if you wanted to make a joint world with someone, you could do that. Or if you wanted to live in a world that's exactly like this one that we live in now, you could do that. And so because it's relegated on the amount of consent that you have, is you can imagine it and you consent to it, you can do it. And so you would be able to have all of the same relationships you have today. You could live in a world exactly like this one if you wished. The only difference would be is you'd have to consent to it, which seems like a much better way.
Once I've sort of signed up to make a world with you, if later on I want to do something slightly different from what you would ideally have me do in this world, who sort of wins, as it were, in that scenario? I say, okay, let's have lamppost be green, and you say, no, I want lamppost black. Is there going to be an answer to which of us gets our way?
Sure. It depends on how we wrote the contract. Like if we say I have all authority in the end, then I get to pick and I just overrule you, or vice versa. Or we can have like a 50-50 rule where like the universe just magically makes half of them red and half of them green or whatever. Like we could decide that in many ways, but it would be determined by however we jointly wrote the rules of the universe.
Yeah. So I can see that there might be some, it seems to me there might be some difficulty here, but it possibly depends a lot on what you think freedom entails. And may I ask you, would you say you're a compatibilist about freedom, or
in general, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I think it makes a lot more sense than if you'd said, no, I'm a libertarian about freedom, when I'd have thought, oh, okay, then I think it's going to fall apart faster. Okay. So it might be then that if compatibilism is true as a theory of free will, then then the best of all possible worlds is different from the best of all possible worlds if libertarianism is true as a theory of free will. And on understanding, maybe it's certainly at least coherent to say yours would be the best of all possible worlds, the world you've imagined.
Quick question comes to mind when you ask that. Like, why would libertarianism versus compatibilism, why would that make a difference to the best of all possible worlds in this context?
Well, I think that it might be metaphysically impossible to put two creatures in one world, have them both enjoy libertarian freedom, and yet guarantee that everything that they do will be with the consent of the other one. Because there has to be a genuine possibility on a libertarian freedom account for someone to do something other than what they actually did do, everything else in the universe up to that moment of choice remaining the same. And if they're interacting with each other, then it has to be that then possible any moment of choice for one of them to do a thing which is other than optimistic with regard to the consent of the first.
I'm not quite sure I would agree with that, because I would say that it's possible to have, like, would you agree? I imagine you're a libertarian in free will, right?
Yeah,
You believe in-
yeah.
So Stephen Hawking had free will, correct?
Yes.
But he's a quadriplegic. He can't punch me in the face. No matter how much he uses his libertarian free will to desire to punch me in the face, he cannot punch me in the face.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine being in a world with me and Stephen Hawking, and we've agreed to the rules such that the laws of physics prevent each of us from punching each other in the face. There are many different ways to do this. We could imagine something like, if I tried to punch Stephen Hawking in the face, he would become ethereal, kind of like a ghost. My fist would just go through him, and I wouldn't be able to touch him. And so now, just as he can no longer punch me in the face, but still has libertarian free will, I can no longer punch him in the face, and I also still have libertarian free will.
Yeah.
So as long as we agree to the statutes of the universe such that it's physically impossible to harm one another, we can still have libertarian free will without having the ability to kill one another.
Yes, that's true. But I wonder if you would be able to extend that, if you like, to all infringements of consent. So you might say, well, Stephen Hawking, you were getting on fine. Neither of us have punched anyone another, and each of us would have wished for the other not to be punched, not to, have a punch. So this is all working very well. Now, what do you really think of my sort of capacity to understand the brief theory of time, Stephen Hawking? Come on, don't pull your figurative punches here. He says in his sort of mechanical voice, something which you think, gosh, that's just what I would have hoped he'd have said to me. Thanks, Stephen. Nothing contrary to my concern there. But then you'll have the suspicion. I wonder, of course, if you're saying that because you really think it's true that I've, got the most profound intellectual appreciation of what you put in that book since, the likes of Einstein strode the earth. Or if you're saying it because you realise that your saying of it is the thing which I would have been hurt to some extent had you not said. And I guess you could say, well, we could consent to be hurt by one another in certain ways in this world, and so that would then mean that Stephen Hawking would be free to tell me what he really thought of me, even if it wasn't this glowing report on my capacity to understand his writings. I wouldn't violate my consent if he hurt me in this way. He doesn't, so we have a literal pulling of punches in this world, and we have a figurative non-pulling of punches condition in this world. So we can hurt each other by our words, if you like, not in some magical way, but just by, oh gosh, it's really upsetting to me that you think I'm such an idiot, and I've read this book as carefully as I could, and I found it very hard to understand. But I'm not physically harmed by that, and that would be possible. It's not clear to me that it would be the best of all possible worlds, or that it's what you were envisaging. But it's another world, and it's very different from our world. That's for sure. I don't know.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's very different from our world. I consider our world very immoral, but I would qualify that and say that, for example, you could write the rules such that even if Stephen Hawking makes fun of you and just eviscerates your ideas and calls you dumb in every possible way, you can have it such that your ears translate that to be positive, happy, fluffy words. And so you're not violating his consent or his free will. And he's criticizing you vehemently, but you hear it as pleasant words. And so you can set it such that you're not you don't hear offended words, or offended words are blocked out, kind of like Twitter, where you just don't see them. If this word is posted, it gets hidden with the squiggly lines or whatever. Or you could allow full consent of like punching. You could say, I would like to be in a world where we can punch each other. And if you both consent to that, that's fine too. And so you can set the world up to allow for any kind of interaction, positively or negatively, or any kind of limitation, depending on your preference. But everyone would still be able to have libertarian free will in that context, because the only restriction would be is you're not allowed to involuntarily impose on another with these laws.
Yeah. I think in the first case it would be a little bit hard for me to understand anyway, because I think it would be then, I wonder if I'm in a world where whenever anyone says anything which I wouldn't like to hear, it instantly sort of gets translated in my mind into something that I would like to hear. I wonder to what extent I could have any relationship with anyone then, because there would be no sense. Tell me what you really think, Stephen Hawking. He says, I think you're, an idiot, and I think you're the best mind since Einstein, and so on. And the conversation goes on. Well, I don't know if this is really a conversation in the end. It's him trying to communicate. And indeed, it might say, well, he might be pretty frustrated at the end of this, because he'll be saying, you're an idiot, and see me smiling and say, oh, thank you very much. And he's like, what on earth are you saying, thank you very much? I just called you an idiot. So he might say, look, I consent to be in a world where my best attempts at communicating what an idiot someone was to somebody would be thwarted by this sort of translation veil through which things had to pass. And at the other side of which they came out with entirely opposite meaning from that which I sort of pumped into them from this side. So I do wonder, gosh, I'm starting to think, this is going to make it hard for two people to be in a relationship if in that first scenario. The second scenario, where I say, okay, let's consent to being able to say to each other things that are going to harm each other. That seems as if that then might be possible, as it were. You might say, let's have a completely frank discussion about what you really think of me, Stephen Hawking. Great. And then we get going and so on, and I come out a bit bruised, but maybe with a great awareness of my own difficulties in understanding physics and whatever. I don't know what Stephen Hawking could learn from an interaction with me, probably not much, but anyway, he maybe learn something from it too, and so on. We're glad to have had the interaction, and we're glad to have consented to the sort of gloves off kind of nature of it. Then I think it becomes okay. So we're certainly having some harms befall us in that world. Consented to harms, that I've got some really hurt feelings now, because I really thought I had done pretty well at this, and Stephen Hawking's brought it home to me that I really haven't done very well at this. And so it seems possible, but whether it would be, it certainly doesn't seem to be a perfect one. There's some good aspects of it. That I'm getting to learn significant truths about my shortcomings. Some bad aspects that these are naturally enough going to upset me. Good aspects that we're having a frank discussion about my abilities at physics. Bad aspects that my abilities at physics are not very good. So it seems to be a much more mixed bag of some good things, some bad things. Certainly very different from the world we're actually in. Although one could imagine in microcosms of creating those worlds. In particular conversation with someone where one says, do you want me to sugarcoat this, or are you prepared to have it as it is? And then they go one way or the other, and so on. I think suppose we sort of bracket that and say, okay, let's suppose that there is a best of all possible worlds, and maybe that it looks like something like this. Then there's a question, I think, whether God would be, were he to exist, would be obligated to create that world rather than a world that's less than the best. So if we imagine that there is a sort of ranking of all possible worlds, and that this one is determinedly the best, it seems as if it would be another step to say that a perfect being would actualize the best world rather than some less than the best one. Some philosophers have thought, of course he would, because he's Leibniz, and so he's always got to have sufficient reason to do whatever he does. And if he looks at any world that's less than the best, he'll find himself with more reason to create a world better than that, and that will keep going until he gets to the top ranked one, and then the choice will be made for him, and he'll produce it. But others have thought, well, it's not clear to me that even if there's a best of all possible worlds, God would need to create the best. And one thought that some have had in this context, actually, I wonder what you make of, is that it's at least pretty clear it couldn't have benefited any of us who actually exist if God had created the best of all possible worlds, because we wouldn't exist in the best of all possible worlds. So if that's true, maybe there's various steps here that you could pick at, but maybe one could argue that we can't say that it's harmed us that God didn't create the best of all possible worlds, because if he had, we wouldn't have benefited from his doing so. And to be harmed by a thing, it has to be a choice. It has to be a case that one would have benefited had the choice been made differently. What do you think about that then? If I say, let's just accept your understanding of best of all possible worlds, and now I'm going to try and say, look, God doesn't need to create it, can still be perfectly good and not create it.
I'm not quite sure I would follow there, because we could technically still be in the best of all possible worlds. Like if everyone in this world consented to be in this world as it is and then consented to lose our memory, we would technically be in the best of all possible worlds at this moment.
Yeah. Right now, as I hear it, I think, well, hang on, we're not, because, you know, I don't know, the other day someone stood on my toe and that wasn't saying I consented to. So that shows me that I'm not in the world in which everything that happens is to the consent of everyone, because I can think of an instance in my life where something happened just a few days ago that wasn't to my consent. But you're saying, well, what if, you know, our memories have been fiddled with in the last 5 seconds and that incident never really happened or something?
Oh, no, more like we pre-existed as souls before entering this universe, and we had full knowledge of what this universe entailed, and we consented to be born into this universe and experience everything that we will experience in our lifetime. And we consented to have this experience without the memory that we consented to it prior to engaging in this world.
Okay, right, yes. So the consent isn't necessarily a need. The consent is just sort of once and full time kind of moment, and then it doesn't need ongoing consent. So if I,
well, in some cases, so I do want to clarify there. Like it depends on which set of rules you consent to. You can consent to one agreement which lasts a set period of time, or you can do manual consent for any individual action. Both of those would be options. And so, like in your example with talking to a person who hears words that just sound pleasant to them. For some people, that would be the case. For some people, it would be that case temporarily. And for some people, it would not be the case, and they'd consent to more violent interactions. And you would essentially just get to choose which kind of world or which kind of people you interacted with. And you'd find the community that you enjoyed being with the most and be able to translate or move from one community to another as you progressed as a person, essentially. Right. And so it's not just, there isn't like a black and white of just must be this way. It's like you get to set yourself up for whatever kind of consent model you would like.
Right. And then you're sort of, though, locked into it. So if I say I'm consenting to live like this for 100 years, then if 50 years in I say, gosh, I wish I hadn't consented to live like this for 100 years, it's really getting pretty tiresome, I'd like to opt out, please. Well, no, sadly now the next 50 years are going to be happening without your continuing consent, in the sense of your active willing of it. But, you know, fair enough, I'll think, because, well, you know, I did sign the 100-year contract rather than the 50 years. And so it'll go on.
Yeah, so if you bind yourself for an X number of years and you consented to that, well, then you have consented to your own torture, essentially.
You
would have to knowingly understand what you would be going through, and if you do knowingly have a consenting adult who does consent to this kind of binding, and they voluntarily walk into it, like Christopher Hitchens going through the waterboarding, you have consented to it. You asked for this. You have bound yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So let's suppose that is a coherent possibility, and that would be the best of all possible worlds. I mean, you say you have done this. I mean, these could not be human creatures. They'd be some sort of, in some pre-existent soul, disembodied state, making decisions over universes, the laws of nature themselves, which would depend on the choices they made. So these would be some sort of super beings who had the capacity by their choices to generate what would then be, for the period they wish them to be, causally sort of closed little micro universes in which they would then live, and then they'd opt out of them again at the end of their contracted period and into this sort of hyper dimension from which they would make the next set of choices. So it sounds as if this, insofar as I can make sense of it, isn't going to be the sort of world which, if it had created, would have any of us in it, me or you. It might have these super beings in it, but they wouldn't be us.
Well, I wouldn't see any problem with God essentially just creating me as I am exactly right now, prior to the universe, and saying, here, look at all the stuff you're going to go through. Would you consent? So I wouldn't see any problem with it was super beings, or literally my consciousness as it is right now in this second. Wouldn't seem to be a problem.
Right. So this would, Right. So this would be what it'd be you as a human being, but you wouldn't have lived before then. You'd just be created sort of ex nihilo, like a sort of Adam's navel kind of scenario where you haven't actually had any of the history you take yourself to have had, or any of the experiences you naturally take yourself to have had, because you were created a few seconds ago in a physical form with the apparent signs of aging and so on, and the pseudo memories and the like that you've had forming the character that you have, and then from that position you would be asked to make a choice of what you want to sign on for in the next 100 years or 50 years or whatever it is. Is that right?
Well, I imagine God could do it any number of ways, but essentially, yeah, God could essentially just start from the time currently right now, even with all the immoral actions, give me a little iPad that gives me my universe selector. I can just go through like that one. And so even I could just grant whatever way God wants to do it. Time travel, God can do time travel. Imagine he can do whatever he wants. I wouldn't, for me, it would be unimportant in which way he generates my consciousness prior to the universe in order to give me the ability to consent. As long as my consciousness is there, I don't, it doesn't really make much of a difference to me.
Yeah. So I think I probably have more narrow constraints on the sorts of things that even God could do, and it be the case that it would be you to whom or for whom he was doing it. So I don't think God could make you an amoeba, turn you into an amoeba, or could this would depend on views of personal identity, but at least on a lot of views of personal identity, it's problematic for God to have made you be born of different parents from those you were actually born of. It seems a little bit problematic for me to say that God could have made you be the person you actually are, who's of whatever age I don't know what age you are, and yet actually have just come into existence 5 seconds ago with a load of false memories of a life you've never led, even though you can make a physical sort of simulacrum of you who believed of themselves that they were whatever age you believe yourself to be and have undergone experiences such as those you believe yourself to have undergone. That simulacrum wouldn't be you, because it precisely wouldn't have undergone the experiences that you take yourself to have undergone. So there wouldn't be true memories there, there'd be just fallacious memories. Whereas I think you're probably a lot more sanguine about God being able to do any of these things, because after all, he's omnipotent. I mean, you say he could time travel. I wouldn't think, well, it depends what you mean by time travel, but I doubt very much that I'm going to think that God can at least make humans time travel in the way that we see in Back to the Future or whatever it is. So there are constraints on God there too. Whereas I think you've got a much more sort of capacious understanding of what omnipotence would be able to do.
Yeah, I think I don't see much challenge with. I think I'm a physicalist, so I of course think consciousness is just a mental state of some kind. Even if it's a soul of some kind, I imagine it is embodied in some kind of ontological substance of some kind, soul stuff. And wouldn't see a problem with God being able to generate this soul stuff in some particular configuration that would map onto my identity. And so it would be no different from us essentially creating a consciousness from an AI, which I think is quite likely going to happen very soon. And so I wouldn't see a problem with God being able to generate consciousness as I am today, but just sui generis at that time in heaven or whatever. To me, that seems quite easy. It'd be like uploading a computer program or a movie, just starting a movie at slide 332 or something. Like it would seem quite easy for God to do that from my perspective. I don't know.
Just on your understanding, then, is there actually not as much problem for the traditional theistic view of the afterlife as some have made out? Because what God needs to do if he wants to bring you back to life after your death is create an exact psychophysical replica of you, and that will be you, because you just are this suite of properties, however it may be instantiated.
Well, maybe like if from the two ways I'd answer, if we are souls and there is some actual identity to us, which should also apply if we're actual physical stuff. If there's some like property which makes us us, and it's instantiated in the universe in some way, then yeah, he could just recreate that property, whatever it is, whether or not it's a soul or whether or not there's some kind of inherent you-ness to this particular configuration of consciousness that maybe it's lost in the next 5 seconds and there's a different person there or whatever. If there really is a you in whatever way that is instantiated, it seems like God could create that or recreate that or transfer that in any way he wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's a little bit of good news for the theists then, that at least the traditional view of life after death is not shown to be false by things we know about the nature of personal identity. It's not the case that someone can say, I'm sorry, after I've died, not even God could bring me back, because the best he could do would be to create a replica of me that thought it was me, but it wouldn't really be me. And hence the traditional view is in trouble. Anyway, that was just curious whether it would have this sort of spin-off benefit elsewhere in the system, but from the theist point of view. But in this case, it seems as if, okay, there is, you think, okay, this is the way the best of all possible worlds would look. It's not true that the best of all possible worlds would not contain us. Now, that might be so, but I wonder if I could try and push that in. We wouldn't contain us because it wouldn't contain. It would just contain sort of, with the greatest respect to you and to myself. We're pretty sort of, flawed characters. We have all sorts of desires that aren't terribly noble. We are, and all sorts of limitations that aren't great. Wouldn't the best of all possible creatures not look like you and me, but they'd look like some sort of angelic sort of spiritual beings who were really sort of Stephen Hawking like in their knowledge of physics, and Michelangelo like in their knowledge of art, and or in their capacity to make works of art, if not their knowledge of art. They'll be like the professor of the history of art in their knowledge of art, and so on. And so it is all. Even if it is true that there is a best of all possible worlds for creatures like us, and indeed it's as you've characterized it, the best of all possible worlds just wouldn't start with the inferior material that is us. It would start with superior material, and then the best of all possible worlds would be the best of all possible worlds for creatures who are themselves very different from us. So it's still the case that even if you have successfully characterized the best of all possible worlds for us, the best of all possible worlds is not that world, because the best of all possible worlds would not contain us.
I'm not sure I would follow that argument. So, for example, if I'm playing a video game, I have the option of turning on God mode and just giving myself infinite money, infinite power, and I can just one hit everything in the game. But I don't do that. Normally, I limit my power to I'm very, very the weakest I could possibly be at the beginning of the video game, and then choose to play and learn as I go. And I think even if we would have the option of starting as infinitely powerful, infinitely knowledgeable beings in every possible context, we would probably not do that. We'd probably limit ourselves in some context to be able to play the video game and experience it from some limited feature and learn and experience things that we could voluntarily choose to just instantly know, but we probably wouldn't do that because it's not fun. It's not as fun. And so we would be examples of people who chose a very seemingly harsh starting environment on this planet if we did exist in the best of all possible worlds, and we limited our knowledge quite a bit in this context. But I wouldn't see a problem with that, because I think that the best life, or the life with the greatest meaning, is the one where you can experience ups and downs and learning experiences and challenges and overcoming them. And so I think that it would make sense, even if we had the option to be those perfect beings, that we'd probably choose to be more like what we are today, or more limited in some context, to experience the full breadth of possibilities.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And you said earlier that, well, hang on, because I said, okay, so this. So you said, well, we don't know. This isn't the best of all possible worlds. Maybe it is. Maybe we've chosen for this. And what
just to clarify, it'd be more like a categorical. I mean, if we were forced into this world without our consent, then there is no good God. If we voluntarily chose to be in here, then God's probably fine.
Yeah. And we don't know of ourselves whether we voluntarily chose, because that would be the sort of voluntary choice that we then have our memory wiped so that we could then enjoy that which we've chosen to do. Yeah. Remind me a bit of a sort of a story from Hinduism where someone's arguing with God about the problem of evil, and the answer is that, oh well, as you know, you're reincarnated, and of course everyone, this is going back ad infinitum into the past, so it doesn't really quite track, but everyone first chooses to live perfect lives, and oh great, more chocolate flies into my mouth. Not chocolate is the example given, but and so on and so forth. They do that for like 70,000 lifetimes, and then they get a bit bored of that. They say, let's try something a bit more challenging. So in other words, they play on God mode for the first 70,000 incarnations. Then they say, let's try now play on this, let's try and play on that. And of course, we're now so many incarnations in that of course, people have chosen to be reincarnated in this way. rather than that. And so that's the solution, if you like, to the problem of evil. You willed it on yourself, but reincarnation is you choose something different next time if you want. So is there then, just on your view then, is there then no problem of evil reason for thinking that theism is false, because there's no reason from the world to suppose that we're not in the world, which is the world which you think would be the best and which you think God would hence create, because we don't know that we didn't consider.
Right, yeah. So from my worldview, there's no logical contradiction with a all good God, but it would contradict the Bible and Christianity quite a bit. So
Right.
my argument isn't specifically against any logically possible kind of a God being perfectly good. There obviously could be one, which if he allowed us to consent to be here and we consent to be here, then yes, there could still be an all good, all powerful God out there, but it wouldn't be Christianity though.
Yeah, I see. Interesting. Could we spin it? I wondered, because I'm thinking, okay, can we take this and maybe make it more sort of amenable to Christian orthodoxy? What does the consent have to be given prior to a thing? Suppose I do I do anything wrong in this scenario? Suppose I sort of I have a child and all seems to be going well, but then, oh no, your child needs a bone marrow transplant if they're to survive. Would I or my wife be suitable donors? No, they'd have to be a sibling of the child. Well, we have no other children. We've not planned to have any other children. Well, okay, it looks as if it's pretty tough luck for your first child, and as it turns out, your only child, and as it turns out, short-lived child. Then I said, okay, to my wife, and we said, let's have another child, and and we have another child, and then the bone marrow needs to be taken out of this second child if it's to save the life of the first. Before such stage as the second child is old enough to consent to the operation and so on. Okay, right. Let's do that. Let's these save a sibling scenarios. We'll save the first child. Bone marrow from the second. What, of course, we intend to do is when the second child is old enough to understand, we intend to explain to the second child what happened, because they'll say, I remember when I was 5 years old, you took me into hospital and you said, look, we can't really explain this to you now. It's pretty painful, but when you're 10, we'll do our best to do so. And I'm 10 now. Explain what was going on then. So we say to a second child, okay, this is what happened. We could only your brother, let's say, who you really loved. Oh yeah, I really love my brother. Of course, I'd do anything for him. Yeah. Well, we knew you would say that in the future, which is why we're at an age when you weren't able to say that for yourself or make the decisions. We took some bone marrow from you, or the doctors did so with our authority, saved your first brother because of it. And the second child says, well, thank goodness you did. Thank you very much. I sort of retrospectively fully consent to this operation. Of course, I didn't know enough then to know what was going on, and I couldn't have consented then because of my partial information and partial level of understanding. But given the level of understanding, given the information that I have now, I really fully and wholeheartedly retrospectively endorse the decision that you made on my behalf, even though prior to the moment of your making it, I hadn't, of course, consented to it. But bingo. Would we then sit back and think, phew, consent condition is satisfied because it happened at some stage in this person's life when they got adequate information, adequate understanding of the situation, that they chose to do the thing which to endorse the decision which we've made on their behalf earlier? Or would you say, no, you should have never done that? Consent was infringed, year 5. Nothing they can do afterwards, however much they understand later on that they didn't understand now, however much they will it that they didn't will then. It's too late. It's got to happen. It's got to happen ahead of the game.
Yeah, so I'd say that would cause like grandfather paradox situation. So I'd say for it to be moral, you would need to essentially download adult level information into the mind of the 5-year-old so it was an adult essentially, and then it could consent to giving its bone marrow, and only then it would be moral to take its bone marrow. And then if it consented to give up the information, you could revert it back to a child and let it grow normally or something, but you must give it full adult ability to consent, and it must give consent at that time for it to be moral.
No, okay, good. So that's then going to put the blocker on the route I was trying to explore to make your view more amenable to traditional Christian theism. Because you could say, suppose you'd been more relaxed about that and said something like, well, if you were to know with absolute certainty that at some future stage they would retrospectively consent to this bone marrow transplant, which of course you don't know as humans, but so if you were to know with absolute certainty that they would, well then okay, it's all right for you to go ahead and use the second child as the bone marrow donor to save the first child. And indeed, maybe it's not even just simply permissible. Maybe it's even obligatory on you, because if you knew that conversely, were you not to use the second child in this way to save the first, then at the age of 10, they would be terribly traumatized and say, oh, of course, I'm still grieving for the loss of my brother. And were you to say to them, oh, yeah, and you know what, you could have saved them if only we'd used your bone marrow in the way that we did, but not wishing to violate your consent, so we didn't. They would be horrified and, will you passionately that you'd chosen differently for them than the way you actually did choose, because they loved their brother and it was terrible watching their brother die. So if you said, okay, fair enough, I'm gonna loosen my understanding here. It doesn't have to be consent given prior to the thing. It can be consent given sort of more or less, any time along the timeline. Then you might say, okay, this could be helpful to the Christian theist as traditionally conceived, because they might be able to say, right, from the sort of vantage point of the beatific vision, it's not clear that we won't all retrospectively consent to the things that have happened to us, even though they can't use the sort of Hindu move that I was sketching earlier, which says, oh, well, of course, we didn't all start off at birth, we've been reincarnated many times. So in fact, way back then in the timeline, we could have well done these things. So, you might say, okay, Hinduism is not adversely affected by this, it seems to me, but it is true. I think if you hold that view about consent, you're going to say, okay, well, Christian theism is really in trouble. I can't see a way around that there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's when I compare the two examples, it seems to me like it would be more moral to give someone the current level of information and allow them to choose for themselves, rather than force them to undergo some kind of situation knowing they would consent in the future. It seems like, given those two options, if you had a choice, giving someone the information at the time so they could choose for themselves would be a more moral option. Therefore, the second option would be less moral by comparison, and so it would be not the morally perfect outcome.
Yeah. Now, it may be you could still fiddle a little bit. I mean, I'm not aware of any theologian who's ever done this, but you just got to have a moment before birth. So is it like, it could be, before birth. Now, none of us remembers this, of course. It's not the Hinduism, right? We've been reincarnated many times. But before birth, there was a sort of 10-second moment where we as pre-incarnate souls were in a sort of heavenly realm, and we thought, oh, this is wonderful. And God says, yeah, sure. You'll come back here later. But for now, I've got to ask you a quick question. Are you to consent to this? And we all went, yeah, okay, well, that's going to be quite a ride. But yeah, okay, sure, let's do it. See you in 80 years' time or whatever it is, one sees one's life expectancy will be. Yeah, you'll see me, don't worry, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Bang, we go in. And as I say, I'm not aware of any Christian theologian or Jewish or Islamic theologian who has said that, but it wouldn't surprise me if someone has, so many of them. And if they did say that, I can't see any other bits of Jewish, Christian, or Islamic theology that fall apart. So if you say, look, I think the problem of evil is a big problem. If you're a Christian theist, is a reason to suppose that Christian theism is wrong, even if it's not a reason to suppose that Hinduism is wrong, or some other sorts of theism that have this. But it might be that, well, okay, depending on the size of the problem, as you can make me think it, I'm going to be rationally motivated to insert this surprising and novel doctrine in my system.
I definitely think it would be a much more appealing solution to the problem of evil, but I believe you would have many doctrinal issues of, wait, what was the whole point of the apple? Why did Jesus have to come again? It seems like, well, if we already consented, we really didn't need Jesus because we already, we were here, and the apple didn't really transmit sin because we already consented to it prior to it. And so we all had an apple. So there'd be many doctrinal issues you'd have to try and fiddle with, but I do think this would be a much more moral interpretation of Christianity than the whole God drowned millions of people in the global flood.
Still be part of it all, so I could say, this is the pre-incarnate moment, and okay, what life will he do? Okay, great, well, I'm going to consent to, and you're going to, okay, so see you on the other side then. Of course, we won't recognize each other because our memory is about to be wiped. But wait a minute, God, before we do this, I noticed that the lives that you've just said, these are lives in which we've sinned terribly, but then how are we ever going to get back to join you after, in my case, I see, it'll be 83 years. And then it'll be a bus that kills me. Oh, okay, I'm going to smoke like a chimney. Oh, no, I'm not. I say I'm not. How are we going to get back? Because the sin is going to be some sort of insuperable sort of moral barrier to you ever receiving us back. So hang on, I'm not going to do that. Okay, God says, yeah, let me introduce my colleague Jesus. He is going to come down and deal with that in this sort of way. Oh, okay, great. Well, now I'm going to consent. If you hadn't told me about the Jesus rescue package, meaning that I could get back here and join you after the 83 years, then I'd have not been in for it. But now that does seem to be right. Now, tell me what's going on with this. Adam says something like, "Oh, what about Eve? Oh, yeah, I'll see you on the other side. Great, look forward to knowing you." But what about this apple? Oh, yeah, this is some. Is there going to need to be? Are you saying, well, at least there need to be some sort of? Oh, this is all analogous. This is an analogy. He says, yeah. Don't worry about that. This is figurative speech. It just means that everyone's basically going to have been a sinner some way or other in their life. Don't worry about the actual, whether it's an apple or some other sort of fruit and so on and so forth. Are you saying that certain literalist understandings of the creation story might have to go?
Yeah. You'd have to reinterpret much of the Bible and say he left out some really important bits, like the fact that we all consider to be here. But yes, you could absolutely always use.
Is built into the hypothesis, isn't it? As I understand it, because you say, well, if you remembered, it's a bit like if you know you're playing the game on God mode, you don't care. Oh, well, whatever happens, it doesn't matter because I'm not going to be killed. To really have the excitement of the game, you have to not remember of yourself that you're playing it on God mode. And so in the same way, God will say, look, I've got to. You understand that part of what it is to live as a human will be to forget that you've got this, pass back up into heaven at the end, because otherwise you won't have the excitement. Yeah, sure, that's what I'm consenting to. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can always make any hypothesis fit the data. It's always possible. It's a problem under determination. So you'll always be able to make Christianity fit the data. But I think that the general interpretation of Christianity would be in quite conflict with this idea. Even though I think it would be better, this would be a better version of Christianity, I don't think most Christians or Jews would technically adopt it, even though I think it would be better.
I'm not aware of anyone who said, oh, my view is basically a Christian one say, but I have this novelty, which is that each of us had a pre-incarnate moment, conversation, if you like, with God, at which he showed us what our lives would be like in all their details and said, well, if we were to consent to them, and asked us if we would like to. And we said in that pre-incarnate, yes. And then he wiped our memories of it and has given them to us. And indeed, my view is that because only so can I make sense of it, God being perfectly good, because to have thrown us into the world without that pre-throwing moment would be immoral, because he can't get that consent post facto and get him off the moral hook. Yeah, I don't know of anyone who has said that. I mean, it might be that nobody has, because they're probably not as you're quite sort of fit. Your consent violations. These are the bad things. Pretty much everything else is fine. And I think most have thought, well, yeah, those are bad things, but there's a lot of other bad things as well. And so even if this got rid of the consent violation problem, there'd be so much more of the problem of evil that I'd have plugged one hole whilst there was a whole colander pouring through over here with this move. So there's, I need something a little bit more systematic to plug all the holes at once or something, rather than to plug this hole with this particular move. That could be why it's not been attractive to people.
Well, I think also would be because that would mean the people who don't go to heaven have consented to go through this life and consented to be in hell for all eternity, kind of a thing.
And I was imagining that everyone was sort of looking down the line. They were saying, "Oh, and then I get to come back with you," and Jesus has solved that scenario for me.
Yeah, but you're going to end up going to hell. So just so you know, you're not going to choose to believe me. It's like, wait a minute. So I go to this world and then I don't get the rewards. I'm going to opt out. Nah.
Yeah, that's true. That wouldn't. It's not easy to imagine how they would rationally make the choice to consent to that. There are other options than traditional hell, of course, but that would then be another. Well, that's quite a big piece of traditional Christian theism that's been shifted around. I mean, I'm happy to do. I'm a universalist, but many others wouldn't be. So your view is more appealing to me now than it was initially, but it's not on balance appealing. But that's primarily because because I think, gosh, there's a lot of other things that go badly for people other than that they have their consent violated, and that's why there's a problem of evil. And hence, if I was to come up with some clever technical fix that preserved a lot of Christian theism but made consent issues go away, I'd think, well, I haven't really done as much for it as I should have done. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your book?
Thank you. I found it very interesting. Yeah. So found it very interesting to hear about your views. And so my work was on the meaning of life, which we didn't really talk about as much after initially as we might have done. But the book you kindly read is called Monotheism and the Meaning of Life, and that came out with CUP in 2019, I think it was. There's a bigger book called God and the Meanings of Life, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2016. And in those books, I tried to look at what you should say about the meaning of life, either if you believe that God exists or if you don't believe that God exists, and then try and compare the pros and cons of each view. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, those would be the books to get to.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much.